Hi friends, welcome to this very special edition of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. I have two very special announcements to make before we kick off into the continuation of this week's studies through the book of Genesis. The podcast has reached a bit of a milestone, which has meant that I've needed to make some important decisions. Just to give you a little bit of background and history, at the very beginning of the pandemic, I launched the first podcast, which was called the Living in Faith Everyday Podcast, which is a very early attempt to try and build a community and find a place where people through a podcast ministry could come and experience the Word of God, along with some prayer time and worship time in a weekly hour-long podcast, which was really necessary, I felt, at that time because of the fact that worldwide we were going into lockdown with the pandemic. Now, that ran for a year or two, still running today, and it gradually and steadily grew till that community of people downloading had grown to about 2,500 people. But of course, then we began to emerge from the lockdown, and I really felt the Lord was asking me to consider what direction I should go with it, and really should I be encouraging people now to go back and connect with their local churches in the local communities in which we live. Having surveyed the community at that time, the decision was made to launch a new podcast, a daily podcast, and the overwhelming result of the vote that I did, about 55% of people asked me to consider switching to a shorter daily podcast in which we would work through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. That launched almost a year ago, and we're well down that process. Season 1 was 70 episodes where I took a short overview, introduction, and explanation of each and every one of the books of the Bible. And then we launched Season 2. About 9 or 10 months ago, we began the daily study proper by beginning to work through Genesis, and we're still in that process today, up to Genesis chapters 27. However, that podcast really took off, and at the moment it's grown exponentially, and at the moment it's receiving over 90,000 daily downloads. So at this point, less than 5% of people are accessing my teaching via the original podcast, the weekly one. They are now mainly accessing it through the daily and have joined in on this journey. The weekly podcast still carried on, and on a Saturday or Sunday, it now sits as a compilation episode of the teaching that I've done over the roughly the last 5 or 7 days, depending where the chapters or the teaching divisions lie. However, I am paying the same amount exactly and hosting fees for the weekly one-off as I do for the daily, and I feel it's reaching a point where, because of circumstances I've been made aware of, where I could consider bringing an end to the weekly one. Now, what caused my mind to focus on it? I was recently approached by my pod hosting company, Buzzsprout, who notified me that once my podcast is over 100,000 daily downloads, then advertising will start to be placed within the podcast. Now, if I leave it as it is on the shorter format, most podcasts are about 10 minutes long, I will have no control over the adverts that appear or when they appear at what point in the podcast episode. So the decision has made to lengthen the daily podcast slightly, cover a little more material and work through it. What that means is that by lengthening the episodes a little bit, I'll be able to put a chapter break in them, and then I will have a sense of control over what adverts Buzzsprout put in. I can't choose advertising, but I have the ability to reject advertising if I don't think it meets with the ethos of what we're trying to do here in the Bible Project podcast. So that's the plan. So you'll see a slightly longer format in the daily Bible project, but you'll also have the opportunity to access loads of extra teaching material at the weekends. Now, in addition to that, I suggest you hang around at the end, because I'm going to be doing some more formal structured teaching, which will be available in a course format and will be hosted on my Patreon website. So I'll give you some more information about that at the end. But what that might also mean for you is that if you're receiving the Living in Faith Everyday weekly podcast, that's probably going to stop in 2 or 3 months. It also means that I'm going to go back and re-edit some of the earlier episodes of the Bible Project podcast to maybe increase the length slightly, or add in a bit of a dovetail of some of the other teaching that I was doing that week. The reason being is so I can lengthen some of those episodes a little bit. I shall try and keep, as best I can, keep the episode numbers, the continuity right, so you can still go back through the catalogue and work through the Bible chapter by chapter, verse by verse. But it's an important time, an important milestone for the ministry, and I really do appreciate every single one of you who listen to this or watch this, and I would encourage you to continue doing so, because this is a really important milestone that we're approaching with 100,000 daily downloads. I would ask that the best way you can help to ensure that this teaching is available to encourage and help other people is to like it, share it, or review it, either through the whatever platform you receive your podcast from, or if you're watching the video through Facebook or YouTube, and subscribe there. But other than that, that's it as a little bit of an extra introduction today. And now let's just head off properly into the book of Genesis, where we'll pick up the text from last time in Genesis chapter 27. So thank you so much for joining me and being on this journey with me. You're a wonderful community, and I really appreciate everything that you do. And let's enjoy this journey together as we enjoy together the rhythm of the Bible every day in our lives. See you at the end.
Hi friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. It's great to have you back here again today. We're in episode 279 of these podcasts, and we're in season 2, which is part 210 of the short daily podcast taking us on a journey through the entire Bible. Season 2 is, of course, the book of Genesis, and we're in the midst of chapter 27, and we're looking at the story of the two twins, Esau and Jacob. And we're in that point where we've seen Rebecca develop this plot to usurp Esau in his inheritance and switch it with Jacob. And this is the point where we see Rachel really develop this underhand scheme further in order to ensure that Jacob usurps his brother Esau in receiving his father's inheritance and blessing. So we'll pick up the text today in Genesis chapter 27, beginning at verse 15, which tells us this. Then Rebekah took the best clothes of Esau, her older son, which she had in the house, and she put them on her younger son Jacob. She also covered his hands and the smooth part of his neck with goat skins. Then she handed to her son Jacob the tasty food and the bread that she had made. So Rebekah comes up with this clever, I suppose, scheme to put an animal skin on his arms and neck so he will feel like his brother if his blind father touches him. So you take the food to him, he says, and your father will think you're Esau. But when we've got this sorted out, if it works, then he's going to bless you instead of your brother. So her scheme boils down to two things: skins and soups. Skins for the arms and the nape of the neck, and soup in his hands. And with those things ready, off he goes to see his father. And then, as they say, the plot thickens. Picking up in verse 18, it says, he went to his father and said, "My father." "Yes, my son," he answered. "Who is it?" Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you have told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game, so that you may give me your blessing. So what's going on here? Clearly, we'll find out that maybe they had slightly different voices. They didn't sound exactly alike, so immediately Isaac's suspicions are aroused. Jacob says to his father, it is I, your firstborn, and I have just done as you told me. So he lies, plain and simple. He tells a barefaced lie, which of course was always part of the plan. And what does Isaac do? And it tells us, then Isaac said to Jacob, come near so I can touch you, my son, to know whether you really are my son Esau or not. Jacob went close to his father, who touched him and said, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. He did not recognize him, for his hands were hairy, like those of his brother. So he proceeded to bless him. Are you really my son Esau? I asked. I am, he replied. Remember, he had told Esau to go out in the field and take his bow and arrow and kill some game and cook it and bring it back. And it appears Isaac is suspicious because he thinks he hasn't had enough time to do all of that. How does anyone get out of a lie when they're confronted with it? Well, sadly, the truth is they usually lie again, and that's what Jacob does here. Only the lie's worse because he's now implicating God in the lie. And what he's doing, in effect, amounts to blaspheming God. The verse, don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain, will come later in our Bible, but that is exactly what he's doing here. He's invoking the name of God to implicate not just himself, but the Lord in his lie, using the Lord as a cover for a lie. Isaac's still not fully convinced, so he says, come here, I want to feel you, I want to touch you. Now remember, I told you earlier, he heard the voice and he had suspected that this wasn't his firstborn son, but the following verse describes what goes on and what finally convinces him that this is indeed Esau, even when it isn't. Then he said, my son, bring me some of your game to eat, so that I may give you my blessing. Jacob brought it to him, and he ate, and he brought some wine, and he drank. Then his father said to him, come here, my son, and kiss me. So he went to him, and he kissed him. When Isaac caught the smell of his clothes, he blessed him and said, the smell of my son is like the smell of the field, the Lord has blessed. It's the smell of him alongside all the other deceptions that finally convince us. Scientists tell us we have an amazing sense of smell, and we can recognize thousands, some scientists say millions, of different smells, and that smells can evoke real memories. So this is probably the bit that finally made this deception successful. Now the actual blessing is going to be stated next, but first we need to recognize the depth of the trickery that has been going on here. Rebekah put the clothes of Esau on Jacob, so that when Isaac smelled the clothes, he got the scent of the older brother, and that's what tripped him over into the deception. And this is the point at which he blesses him. And this is the blessing, verses 28 and 29. May God give you heaven's dew and the earth's riches, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and people bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. So contained within this, there are three different blessings. The first is one of material prosperity. The second is that he's going to rule over people, including his own brother. And the third is that anyone who curses him will themselves be cursed by God. Well, we'll pause there, but we'll unpack these blessings together in the next episode, and also talk about why they are irrevocable, even those that were received, even the fact that these blessings were received via deception. So as I said, this is a reinstatement of the blessing given earlier. and echoes chapter 12, where we heard about the reception of the Abrahamic covenant, where God said anybody who blesses the Jews are going to be blessed, and anybody who curses the Jewish nation are going to be cursed. Now, granted, Jacob's blessing here is oral, it's not written down, but according to the rules of that day, what Isaac said here is completely legally binding. He was blessing Jacob, and that blessing would be unalterable. It cannot be revised. As a matter of fact, there are records that archaeologists have dug up today of accounts of oral oaths similar to those written, similar to this described here, and at those as being recognized as still applying hundreds, if not thousands of years later. So we know that this agreement, no matter how it was given or received, was legally binding. Today, we would say for something to be legally binding, you have to have a contract signed and have signatures witnessed, sometimes two independent signatures witnessed. But they didn't do that in those days. But this was the way still of legally binding an agreement by swearing an oath orally. Give you my blessing equates, giving someone a blessing in this way equates to authorizing their inheritance. Jacob gets blessed, and in doing so, he usurps the family inheritance. He receives what Esau thought he should have. Now, if you've got a Bible, it tells me that you really don't need to watch soap operas for dramatic stories and twists and turns, do you? As we've worked through, particularly this chapter of Genesis, it sometimes feels to me like we've hardly come across an honest character yet, or an honest way of behaving yet. We've just seen Isaac go off and marry 2 Hittite women, and by doing so, he deliberately disobeys God. And Jacob here is going along with his mother, and he's lying, and in the way he lies, he's actually blaspheming God in the process. We could understand why. We would understand why it would seem reasonable if God were to get completely disgusted with all these people, yet these are still the people that he chooses to bless. These are still the people that he will use to outwork his will. But the plot, believe it or not, is going to take another twist. So we're going to pick up the passage in verse 30 when it says, "After Isaac blessed him and Jacob had scarcely left his father's presence, his brother Esau came in from hunting. He too prepared some tasty food and brought it to his father. Then he said to him, 'My father, please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may give me your blessing.' His father Isaac asked him, 'Who are you?' 'I am your son,' he answered, 'your firstborn Esau.' Isaac, trembling violently, said, 'Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? I ate it before you came, and I blessed him, and indeed he will be blessed.' When Esau heard his father's word, he burst out with a loud and bitter cry and said to his father, 'Bless me too, my father.' So remember, Esau, he'd gone out to kill animals as he'd been instructed in order that he could come back and fix his father's favourite meals. And when he returns, Isaac finds out, and he comes in with that food. This is the point at which Isaac recognizes that a deception has been played on him. Now, the text says he trembled violently. In fact, the particular Hebrew word used on this occasion has several different meanings. One possible meaning is that he was terrified. He was fearful of the consequences of this. He realized that what he'd done was he had blessed the son that he didn't intend to bless. But anyway, not surprisingly, Esau is seen to cry out with a loud and bitter cry and says to his father, begs his father to bless him as well. Let's pick up the text in verse 35. But he said, your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing. Esau said, isn't he rightly named Jacob? This is the second time he's taken advantage of me. He took my birthright, and now he's taken my blessing. Then he asked, haven't you received any blessing from me? Stole it. That's what he's saying. That's what Jacob's done. And that's true. What he and his mother have done, in a sense, amounts to stealing. And he talks about him being that way since birth. Now, you remember at birth, they called Jacob a supplanter. Do you remember the details? When they were born, we noticed that Esau came out first, yet Jacob grabbed his heel. Now, his name actually translates as heel grabber, and the image behind this is about the idea of if you are running in a foot race and one runner grabbed the heel of the runner in front of him, it would cause him to trip, and the second runner would be able to overtake him. And that's what's going on here. That's what he's saying. That's what he's saying he's done before, and that's what he's done right from the beginning at the point of birth. And then Esau says, he cheated me out of my birthright, and now he's cheating me out of my blessing. Now, is that exactly true, particularly when it comes to his birthright? Excuse me. Do you remember how Jacob got the birthright? Remember that story we looked at not long ago? He came back from the field. Esau was hungry, and he said, give me some soup. Remember that story? And he said, yeah. And Jacob said, yes, I'll give it to you. I'll give you something to eat, but give me the blessing. And he gave up his birthright for the food. So Esau is saying here that he tricked him, he took it from him, but that's not exactly what really happened. Not at all. He gave it up. He surrendered his birthright. He exchanged it for nothing more than a bowl of soup. And now he's blaming his brother for that also. And Esau answered, I have made him lord over you, and have made all his relatives his servants. I have sustained him with grain and new wine. So what can I possibly do for you, my son? Esau said to his father, do you have one more blessing, my father? Bless me too, my father. Then Esau wept aloud. So Esau still wants to receive a blessing from his father. And his father answers and says, all right, I'm going to bless you, but we need to pay careful attention to what this blessing is. I wonder if Esau is going to get what he expects. Well, we look at that in the next episode, where we'll draw this all together and try and reach some conclusions. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for joining me. A quick message that there's always a transcript of these talks in any audio version of the website that you might find. If you're watching a video version, there's always a link through to the audio version, which is hosted on Buzzsprout, or you might be accessing it through any number of podcast hosts and providers. You are absolutely free to use those transcripts and this material in any way you want. You can reconstitute them as Bible teaching or messages of your own. Now, some of you may be aware that I have a Patreon page where people can become a patron and support my work from £2 a month. And I'm planning to put exclusive material on that platform very soon that is only available to those patrons, because I'm planning to offer some more course type teaching material to help disciple Christian believers. Now, the cost of doing that across all these platforms would be and is considerable. So by subscribing as a patron of me, you will receive access not only to those course materials, but lots of other exclusive material. The course that I'm planning to do, launch in about 3 months' time, is a guide to expository preaching. As a preacher of some experience, I am a particular fan of expository teaching, in other words, working through the Bible within its context, verse by verse, and passages in the Bible. And I would, if you feel that God's called you to teach His Word, then I would love over 12 to 15 episodes of about 30 minutes give you a way in which you can prayerfully approach and prepare that type of a sermon message. So if that's something you think you'd appreciate, or any of the other materials that you'd like to access, just follow the link over to my Patreon page and sign up there. And you're not only enabling the main work, which is the Bible Project Daily podcast, to be made available to more and more people and make it more widely seen, but you're also maybe be able to begin that discipleship journey where you yourself can begin to help introduce the rhythm of the Bible into the lives and the power of the Holy Spirit into the hearts of people. But that's it for today. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you back here very soon on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye for now.